Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for another one-man review. I got a really cool new book from Fantagraphics, almost a surprising book to come out from Fantagraphics, but I get why they're doing it. It's called Braba, and it's a collection of Brazilian comic artists, an exposure to the comic scene in Brazil, and a lot of really cool artists in here. The reason I'm surprised this is a Fantagraphic book is just the look of a lot of the artists in here feels a little more mainstream than Fantagraphics would normally go. And I don't know if that's just because that's more what people are drawing like in Brazil, or that's just who Rafael, I assume, since it's Brazilian, Rafael Grandpa, that as the editor picked, and Rafael Grandpa, someone that's working in the mainstream industry, would just have those tastes. I don't know. But really liked most of the art in here. Follow a lot of artists that I checked out on Instagram, a lot of them where I'm hoping, oh man, I hope some of this stuff gets translated. So as I normally do with an anthology, just going to give you like one spread from each artist to give you a taste of what's in the book. This is organized and edited by Rafael Grandpa. Really, really cool artist, kind of like Frank Quietly and Jeff Darrow mixed together. If you haven't seen Rafael Grandpa's work, check out that artist. Very, very phenomenal artist, and has put together an anthology with a lot of really cool artists. So it looks like Brazil has a really vibrant, exciting comic scene with a lot of different styles going on. So the first one here is Amanda Miranda. This one was pretty explicit in most of it, but really cool looking story. Really like some of the like texture tricks that they're doing on the computer, obviously, like scanning printed material or applying like weathering materials in a weird way to get like this kind of screen print on canvas look or something. It's very interesting. I like it quite a bit. Not so much going on in story there. I'd just like to see something longer. Bruno Seelig, you could see this is one of those things where it's like this isn't your standard Fantagraphics fare. It feels more like a Boom Studios type of fantasy book, but with like Craig Thompson level amazing cartooning, but applied to like fantasy art with that same type of dry brush thing he does, the same fluidity, these really awesome creatures here. So Bruno Seelig is someone whose art, and this is just a fun story about a wizard too. This is someone I would really like to see some larger works getting translated into English. I would definitely get a whatever, however complete and ongoing library fleshing out that you could get from Bruno Seelig, because I really, really like this art. And I think this would be really good stuff for like young adults, which is another thing that surprises me that it's a Fantagraphics thing here. This one makes more sense to me. This is by an artist named Diego Sanchez, a much more down-to-earth thing, just about like being in the city, and it's a little bit in the future. Some really nice clean line art. Reminds me a little bit of like Rand McDonald, I think, but really, really dig the cartooning in here. I like these more musical stuttered compositions of the panels as well. I think that's a very beautiful thing that I'm seeing more and more of. There's a really interesting piece here that I might have to revisit because it took me a second to latch onto what was going on. This is by Gabriel Goes, and they're these like linearly half-toned images, and they're based on the tarot cards. So you have Strength, the Chariot, the Hermit, the Wheel of Fortune. I at first thought they were just a series of illustrations, but then as you get into it, they're telling a story about this guy like being hunted or whatever out in the Amazon jungle or something. So an interesting format here. I didn't quite get the relationship between, and I made some art based on the tarot and stuff, so I'd have to go back and really like think my way through it. Like the Wheel of Fortune is pretty obvious. We've got Russian roulette here, but there is some story being told here where obviously this guy's been shot and the Rangers are coming out. So I think it's an interesting way of kind of telling a more like a mystery that you got to put together using previous knowledge of what these symbols mean. But which is what occult does, is like if you can interpret the symbols, you're on the inside, and if you can't, you're on the out. So this story kind of has that feeling to it. Another artist that I'm really, really high on now and really want to see more by, would love to see some full works, is Jefferson Costa. Jefferson Costa has this very like cartoony style meets Sergio Topi mark making. Like, this is very Sergio Topi, but with Andrew McLean type of like forms underneath. There's kind of some Mike Mignola influence there. Really, really interesting stuff. It's very loose, even in the way it's colored, and I quite like that. And this looks like an artist who has some volumes out, but nothing in English. So really stoked on this artist. Following on Instagram. If anything ever comes out in English, I'm right there. Jessica Groke, I think is how the name would be pronounced. This is very different from a lot of the other work. You can see there's a wide variety in here, which I really, really appreciate in anthologies as well. And this is obviously about a mother just dealing with a young mother dealing with her child and the difficulties of being kept awake and all that. So really nice kind of break in all of the more actiony, high color stuff. That was really cool. Then there's a collaborative story between the artist Joao Pinheiro and the story by Sirlene Barbosa. This one's interesting in that it's mostly black and white all throughout, and then it ends with just like this one color page. So like as someone their day gets better, they find out something nice that's like they can see the color again. Interesting idea. I like the line work style of this artist better when it has the color to organize the composition more. It's a little bit more like all over in terms of focal points and spotting of blacks, and none of the blacks are ever like filled in all the way, which when color goes on top of it adds like texture to it, but makes it just a little bit harder to lock onto in black and white. So really enjoyed that last color page, and it made me want to go back and see the rest of the thing colored. We get a very different change in style, much more mainstream, much more like kids' book again. This really cute story here about these kids trying to get the perfect spaghetti length. I love this shot with like the blurred out cartoon eyes and then the big thick black lines up front marking the spaghetti. I think the line works strangely clumpy in this for this type of cartooning. That really nice flowing like line works better. I don't know what all these line weight variations are all about. But other than that, like I really thought this was fun, and the colors are just silly. And again, like showing that this book has a real variety and that Brazil has a real variety. This story here is by Pedro, I believe it's Cobiaco is the last name. Another artist that has some very, not like Sergio Topi, but that same very like loose, dry, brushy, rough, almost looks like maybe it's just adjusted pencils, very direct style of drawing. Unfortunately, in this book, this is an artist who I think needs to be printed on shiny paper because they use such dark colors that when you print it on the uncoated papers or the matte papers, like some of the saturation of the colors, it gets so close to the black that it gets a little hard to see. It's like watching a Disney movie from the last 5 years. So it's unfortunate because I really like the art in here, but I think this would have been benefited from shiny paper. It's one of the problem of like an anthology, whether it be a bunch of artists or even a one man, like as you change styles and looks, sometimes paper changes help, and you can't do that. A much more experimental story from artists that really caught my attention in this one is Pedro Franz, just someone who's working in the avant-garde, someone who's working with more like art school come to comics type of stuff. Some of these more like theoretical ideas about language and images showing up in the work. Really, really interesting. I don't want to go too deep into it, suggest reading it, but also seeing that there's a history of comics coming into it as well with these drawings of Tintin. One of the things that I think is really, really interesting about this particular project, and I don't know if this is actually how it was made or not, but there's a suggestion that this is how this was made. I pictured a large sheet of paper that I would keep drawing on for a long time, maybe weeks or months or even years and years, draw, scan, and then erase and draw again on the same paper and repeat layer upon layer many times, like to create these stories. So I don't know if that's how this is made. There's definitely some suggestion of erasing, but not enough where I'm seeing other like the direct connection between the images necessarily. Like this is over here, but I don't know. I'm not sure. And then given that they're using like graphite and smudging it around a bit, it's pretty obvious that this as comics would be tied to the way William Kentridge approaches animation, where he does animation with charcoal all on one piece of paper and just erases and manipulates and smears the charcoal. It's hard for me to imagine that Pedro Franz hasn't seen that, but it's not acknowledged in here either, so I'm not sure, but it looks like the idea of a William Kentridge applied to comics, which is a really interesting kind of material constraint, and that's played out in the dialogue in an interesting way. So another artist I'm really curious to see what else they have to offer. This story here is a kind of funny one. I wasn't so into the story. I got a little bored with it over time. It was about vampire who wakes up post-COVID. So funny. I really did like the art. This is written and drawn by Rafael Coutinho, I believe is the name. Again, I'm going on like Brazilian Portuguese here with the Rafael rather than Rafael. That's what you get for watching too much mixed martial arts. But I think, yes, if they're from Brazil, this is Rafael Coutinho. And really like some of these almost like 1960s, 1950s, 60s like shapes, advertising shapes on the composition, and some of the colors are really cool in this one. But the story to me was like a little crazy and silly. A fun story here, the art reminds me a little bit of Tyler Crook, like with the more painted look. I love that you can see the like texture of the watercolor paper on there. This is by the artist Shiko, and it's just about a woman who's letting a guy know she's pregnant and they're partying. He's kind of freaked out by it. So a fun one there. And it ends with a really interesting like piece of the labyrinth here, some cool compositions throughout, and a really interesting style that's like heading back towards like photorealism, but then has a lot of like cartooning and abstraction in it, depending on like how close you get to any given part of the image. Like this is much more realistic looking, and it's much more designy and abstract, then you get realistic again. So someone who works back and forth between these two styles. I think the abstract stuff goes better because there is a lot of abstraction and there's a little bit of like mushiness in the face, whereas these that have less going on in them, that softness lends to the cartooning, and this more realistic to me doesn't work as well. But then the realistic stuff on the Minotaur is really cool. So I don't know, it's a really interesting mix of styles. I particularly love these more open, loose kind of painterly images like this. But another artist here with Wagner Willian that I want to know more about this artist, and that's how I feel even on this one, where like this particular story I didn't like. I really like some of the stuff going on in the art. I really like what's going on in the coloring in panels like this. So a ton to recommend in this book, a ton of artists to follow up on. It's Fantagraphics, so it's beautiful production all throughout, and yeah, there's really not a single miss in this book for me, which is really rare for Anthology. So highly recommend this. Definitely get yourself a copy of Braba. Easter.